Chapter 3. Man is asleep. Soon afterwards, Ouspensky talked of the all-important factor of consciousness, and characteristically he plunged straight into his subject without any preamble. Man, he said, is asleep. In sleep he is born, in sleep he lives, and in sleep he dies. Life for him is only a dream from which he never awakes. It is difficult for me to recall, after all these years, how I took this dramatic announcement, but if my memory serves me aright, it did not occasion me much surprise. After all, this was no new idea. Many people had commented on the dreamlike quality of life, and I recalled the story told by that inimitable old Chinese sage, Chuang-Tzu, a contemporary of Lao Tzu. He recounts how, after falling asleep in his garden, he awoke and was puzzled to know which was a dream and which was real life. The story ran as follows. Once upon a time I, Chuang-Tzu, dreamt I was a butterfly, fluttering hither and thither. To all intents and purposes, a butterfly. I was conscious only of following my fancies as a butterfly, and was unconscious of my individuality as a man. Suddenly I awoke, and there I lay, myself again. Now I do not know whether I was then a man dreaming I was a butterfly, or whether I am now a butterfly dreaming I am a man. But I soon recognized that Ouspensky was not speaking in a poetic or figurative manner about man's being asleep. He meant us to take his words literally, that we were all living in a sleep-walking world, a world inhabited by people who moved about in a twilight of consciousness, and yet imagined themselves to be awake. What a strange idea it was, and yet not altogether incredible. A sleeping world, people walking in the streets, sitting in government offices, conducting affairs of state, hurrying into the lobby to record their votes, dispensing justice from the bench, giving orders, writing books, doing 100 different things, and everything done in a state of sleep. This was what he was implying. Ouspensky next drew our attention to the fact that in the West the word consciousness was very badly misused, and not only in popular speech, but also by psychologists who ought to know better. Consciousness, he said, was not a function, as many Western works on psychology implied, but it was an awareness of a function. For example, some people use the word consciousness as though it were synonymous with thinking, but thought could take place without any awareness of its existence on the part of the thinker, and consciousness could exist without there being present any thought. Consciousness was a variable which exerted an influence on function, the presence of a greater degree of consciousness having the effect of improving the quality of our various activities. The more conscious we were of doing something, the better we did it. Ouspensky illustrated what he meant by means of a simile. He likened the several centers we had been studying at previous meetings to so many machines set up in a factory, machines which were quite capable of working in the dark, but which worked very much better if candles were lit in the room in the factory in which they had been installed. When electric lighting was substituted for the candles, the performance of the machines improved still further, and when the closed shutters of the factory windows were thrown wide open and daylight admitted, the machines worked at their maximum efficiency. Light here represented consciousness, and he said that experience would show us that the degree of our consciousness varied throughout the day, sometimes being a little more and sometimes a little less. If we continued to observe ourselves carefully, we should find that the moments of our coming to and of realizing our existence were very short and were separated from each other by long stretches of self-oblivion, in which we thought, felt, moved, and act without being in the least conscious of our existence. It was nonsense to say, as many people did, that we were aware of ourselves, and if we were honest, we should have to admit that we passed the day in a state of waking sleep. a state which lay somewhere between sleep in bed and wakefulness or true self-awareness. We talked, performed our duties, ate and drank, wrote letters, made what we regarded as being important decisions, wrote books, made peace and declared war, in a state of consciousness so low that it was usually nearer to the condition of sleep than to that of self-awareness. Only for a moment or two did we occasionally become conscious of our existence, and then, like people who had turned over in bed and half opened their eyes, we closed them and lapsed back into our dreams again. Uspensky pointed out that the lower the level of our consciousness, the blinder and more mechanical became all our actions, and the more subjective we were in our outlook. When a person was asleep in bed at night, he interpreted the muffled messages reaching him from the outside world entirely subjectively, weaving them into the fabric of his dreams. For example, the pressure of the bedclothes on his feet was converted into a dream in which he imagined himself caught in the mud of a bog just at the time that he was escaping from some enemy, or a tingling along the nerve to the fingers would be interpreted by the dreamer as an attack being made on him by angry bees. In other words, a man's views on what was happening to him when he was asleep in bed at night were entirely subjective views, which bore very little relationship to the truth. When he got up in the morning, he was able to see things a little less subjectively, but even then, he was unable to see them as they really were. It was only in a higher state of consciousness that it was possible for a man to see himself and the things around him as they really were, and not merely as he imagined them to be. Uspensky then went on to say that there were 4 states of consciousness possible for man, and that we were familiar only with 2 of these, namely, with sleep in bed at night and with the state of consciousness in which we spent the day, a state which he proposed to call waking sleep. Above these 2 customary states, there were 2 higher levels of consciousness, the first of them being the state previously referred to as self-remembering or true self-consciousness. Uspensky said that this was associated with a vivid sense of one's own existence as well as of what was happening around one, and it was a state of consciousness which some of us might have experienced accidentally, especially during our childhood. The 4th and highest state of consciousness was objective consciousness, sometimes referred to in literature as cosmic consciousness. Flashes of this higher level of consciousness might also occur in quite ordinary men and women, and seemingly by accident, but if one went more carefully into the history of those who had experienced them, one found more often than not that they had subjected themselves previously to certain inner disciplines and had been deeply stirred emotionally. The best accounts of this highest state of consciousness were to be found in religious literature under the heading of illumination or enlightenment. Uspensky said that in a state of true self-consciousness, a man was able to see himself objectively as he actually was, and that in the highest state of all, he could see everything else objectively. It was for this reason that this highest state of consciousness had been given the name of objective or cosmic consciousness. The way to these higher states of consciousness lay through the state which was immediately below it. Thus, objective consciousness was reached by way of the intermediate state of true self-consciousness, so that the man who had attained this level might occasionally experience flashes of the level above it. Just as ordinary people who lived in a state of waking sleep might occasionally experience accidental flashes of true self-consciousness. Only by prolonged work on himself and by severe inner struggle was it possible for anyone to attain these higher levels at will, and not just accidentally. Yet man had a natural right to possess the 3rd state of consciousness, that is to say, the state of self-awareness which he had lost through wrong education, wrong methods of living, and through the constant neglect of the higher parts of his nature. Uspensky said that the sleep into which he had fallen was not so much a natural sleep as a trance state induced in him by the above errors, and, this being so, it was possible for him to awake from it and claim his right to true self-awareness. But for this to happen, 3 things were essential. First, that a man should realize that he is actually asleep. Second, that he should receive help from someone who had himself managed to wake up and consequently who knew how this could be done. And third, that he should be willing to embark on a long and very difficult struggle. At this point, Uspensky reminded us that, although the idea of man's being asleep was new to some of us, there was nothing novel in it at all. It could be found in the Gospels, where such words as awake, watch, and sleep were repeatedly used by Christ. For example, there was the Gospel accounts of Christ's disciples being forgetful and falling asleep at a critical moment of their teacher's life when he had left them for a time in the Garden of Gethsemane in order to go away and pray by himself. But, said Ouspensky, people did not realize the sense in which the words sleep, awake, and watch were used in the Gospels, but interpreted them wrongly or in some vague poetical sense. And even if such people were told about this third state of consciousness, that it was a state of self-awareness, a sense of being present, of being there, of thinking, perceiving, feeling, and moving with a certain degree of control and not just automatically, they often said that this was their usual state and that they saw no reason for regarding it as being in any way unusual. In other words, they clung to their comforting illusions that they were conscious beings, captains of their souls and masters of their own fate. This being so, it was to be expected that such people would give the customary interpretation to Christ's words, watch and pray. Uspensky advised us to examine for ourselves this idea that man was asleep and to see whether it were true or not. It would be an error, he said, to accept it blindly or to dismiss it without having examined it, as many people did, more particularly because it was possible for us to wake up, even if only for a minute or two, as critical moments in our lives when clear vision and right action were specifically necessary. He reminded us of the fact that even a slight increase of consciousness was sufficient to change the working of our machines for the better. But, and now Ouspensky spoke with great emphasis, the first step for you to take is to find out for yourselves whether this be true or not, that you are not present when you are doing things, that you have little or no responsibility for what is happening. Observe yourselves very carefully, and you will see that not you, but it speaks within you, moves, feels, laughs, and cries in you, just as it rains, clears up, and rains again outside you. Everything happens in you, and your first job is to observe and watch it happening. Ouspensky suggested our making for ourselves a simple experiment which he had himself made when he had first heard this idea of sleep and had begun to work on himself. He recommended us to sit down by ourselves in a room in which we should not be likely to be disturbed, to look at the hands of a watch lying near us on a table, and to see for how long we could maintain the following idea and feeling. I am sitting here looking at the hands of a watch and am trying to remember myself. This did not seem to most of Ouspensky's hearers a very formidable undertaking, but 2 or 3 experiments with self-remembering were sufficient to show us how difficult it actually was. Stray thoughts kept intruding into the circle of our awareness and sweeping us out of it, so that we were repeatedly losing the feeling of I, to awake a minute or two later to the fact that we had been completely lost in our imaginations and were now at a table staring blankly at the hands of a watch. The feeling of I was evidently so weak in us that nothing was so trivial that it was not able to dispel it. It was humiliating to find how often we disappeared into cloud cuckoo land during the experiment, to return only much later to what we were supposed to be doing. But Ouspensky urged us to continue repeating these efforts in spite of all our failures, saying that the first step to self-remembering was that we should realize up to the hilt of our complete inability to do so. He also said that the more we appreciated our present psychological state of sleep, the more we should appreciate the urgent need to change it. For me, the idea that man was asleep presented no particular difficulties, and I accepted it far more readily than I had been able to accept Ouspensky's previous statement that we were machines, that everything happened in us, and that we possessed no will. And the reason for the difference in my attitude in these two complementary theories was easily explained. It was that I had not yet felt in myself the full force of my mechanicalness, whereas I had experienced in my childhood those stirrings in sleep which Ouspensky had described as being moments of accidental self-remembering. I could recall how when running about in a certain meadow in Suffolk, I had stopped suddenly, looked around me with surprise, and, at the same time, experienced a heightened feeling in my own existence. This acute sense of being was so overwhelming that it was a little bit frightening, and whenever these moments came, I would usually stand there in silence until they had passed. Then the strong current of life would catch me and carry me along with it, so that I would become completely immersed again in whatever I had previously been doing. After I had grown up, I had read many learned psychological works by Western authors, but nowhere was I able to find any reference to the queer changes of consciousness I had experienced. Now, for the very first time, I was hearing something which threw light on them. And it is indeed puzzling that no Western psychologist has shown any interest in these fluctuations of consciousness. It is particularly surprising that Freud, the man who did so much to explore the subconscious and unconscious regions of the mind, never postulated the existence of states above the customary level of consciousness. If there be states below this level, then surely it is likely that there are also states above it. Yet Freud deliberately turned his back on the phenomenon of superconsciousness, or what in religious literature is known as illumination or enlightenment. His neglect of this subject is probably to be explained by the fact that he was a medical man, and as such was more deeply concerned with psychopathology than with psychology itself. Moreover, he was deeply prejudiced against all forms of religious feelings, dismissing them as illusory. It was only after I finished my examination of Freud and turned to William James, a psychological genius with a much wider vision than Freud had, that I was able to find anything relevant to the subject in which I was so deeply interested in. It is obvious from the following passage that William James had himself experienced the puzzling changes of consciousness to which I am referring, and possibly even higher states than these. One conclusion was forced upon my mind, he writes, and my impression of its truth has ever since remained unshaken. It is that our normal waking consciousness, rational consciousness, as we call it, is but one type of consciousness, whilst all about it, parted by the filmiest of screens, there lie potential forms of consciousness entirely different. William James is right. But what he failed to add was that by the use of certain methods, it is sometimes possible to break through these flimsy screens which separate one state of consciousness from another, and to live for a moment or two in a world of much wider horizons and of far greater vividness than our usual world. In other words, to be, in the full sense of those words, rather than merely to exist. Later, I discovered that William James was by no means the only Western writer who has pointed out the variability of man's consciousness. First, I ran across certain interesting references to it in the works of Dr. Hewlings Jackson, the founder of the British School of Neurology. He wrote, "There is no such entity as consciousness. In health, we are from moment to moment differently conscious. Another reference to changes in consciousness is to be found in the writings of that much misunderstood genius Nietzsche. Consciousness, he wrote, is regarded as a fixed given magnitude. Its growth and intermittences are denied. It is accepted as the unity of the organism. This ludicrous overvaluation and misconception of consciousness has, as a result, the great utility that a too rapid maturing of it has been hindered. Because men believe that they already possess consciousness, they give themselves very little trouble to acquire it. From Joyful Wisdom. It is surprising how close Nietzsche has come to what Ouspensky later said about the chief obstacle to man's acquiring more consciousness being his mistaken belief that he already possessed full consciousness. And I wondered whether Nietzsche had, at one time or another, established contact with Eastern teaching on this subject. This is quite possible, for it is well known that he was a great admirer of Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer was very strongly influenced by Eastern thought. Self-observation soon confirmed for me the truth of Ouspensky's statement, that we did everything without our being aware of ourselves while we were doing it, our attention being entirely taken up with the activity, so that none was left over for simultaneous consciousness of ourselves. It was only by deliberately dividing the attention and by directing a portion of it backwards onto ourselves that awareness of ourselves could be maintained. And I realized that this artificial division of attention was the gist of self-remembering and also of self-observation. When we made this division, the backward glancing part of our attention took note of our own thoughts, feelings, and movements, and became what we now call the observing eye, and what the Hindu philosopher calls the witness. As we became more practiced in self-observation, much of our work lay in comparing our psychic state with another psychic state. For example, contrasting the darkness of the waking sleep in which we spent practically the whole of the day with the glimmer of light which appeared whenever the observing eye awoke in us for a moment or two. Naturally, all self-observation came to an end when we were identified with something, since no one was present to act as observer, but occasionally we managed to catch ourselves in a transition stage, either emerging out of sleep or else on the point of slipping back into it again. If we caught ourselves in this act of disappearing, it was sometimes possible, with a special kind of effort, to struggle back again towards wakefulness. In course of time, we became more and more familiar with the difference between these two contradictory movements, the outward movement of dispersal into dreams and the reverse movement backwards towards ourselves, so that we were no longer dealing with ideas but with actual experiences. G's statement that man was asleep passed for us out of the realm of theory into the realm of living facts. Ouspensky told us how a deep realization that man was asleep came to him quite soon after he had heard the idea of sleep from G in the year 1915. He said that he had been seeing G off on the Moscow train after one of his periodic visits to St. Petersburg, and that whilst walking home along Trotsky Street, he suddenly realized that the man who was approaching him on the pavement was fast asleep. Ouspensky has since then described this episode in his book, published many years later, In Search of the Miraculous. Although his eyes were open, he was walking along, obviously immersed in dreams, which ran like clouds across his face. It entered my mind that if I could look at him long enough, I should see his dreams. But he passed on. After came another man, also sleeping. A sleeping izvoshchik went by with two sleeping passengers. Suddenly, I found myself in the position of prince in the sleeping princess. Everyone around me was asleep. These sensations lasted for several minutes. This experience of waking up for a moment or two in a sleeping world, and the feeling of strangeness which accompanies it are not usually accidental events, but are the result of previous efforts to self-remember. I have similar recollections of coming to in this way. It took place during the rush hour in a London tube. There I was, a startled spectator of a strange world, gazing at serried ranks of people being carried down into the bowels of the earth on moving stairways, and at equally heavy laden stairways moving up to meet me, and they were all asleep, as I had been asleep a minute or two ago, some of them frowning, some smiling, and some of them devoid of any expression at all, but with eyes which stared and saw nothing. Whither were we all bound, we entranced people, and what was the force which drew us along in our sleep? Some of us were obviously more obsessed than others with the need for speed, for these restless ones were wriggling and pushing their way through the crowd, as individual fish can sometimes be seen floundering through a shoal. Where were we all going, we sleeping and hurrying people, and what should we do when we got there? Were our private wills responsible for all this commotion, or were we being swept along by some great force as relentless and as impersonal in character as the drag of the moon on the seas? At one of his meetings, Ouspensky had said that masses of humanity were under the influence of the moon, but for a long time I found this idea too far-fetched to be accepted. Ouspensky repeatedly returned to the subject of self-remembering. It could be regarded, he said, as the central idea of G's whole system of thought, and it was the answer to many of the questions we asked at meetings. What should I do on such an occasion? Somebody would inquire, and the answer came back promptly: try to self-remember. But if self-remembering was difficult when one was alone and in favorable circumstances, it was well nigh impossible when in company and exposed to all the distractions of everyday life. Ouspensky was well aware of this, but he wanted us to realize more deeply than we did the fact that we were asleep, and as he had already said, the first step to the achievement of self-remembering was the realization that we did not remember ourselves. So, little by little, the idea that man was asleep, but that by making a certain kind of effort, he could stir himself out of his deepest sleep and partially come to, became more real to us, passing from the realm of theory into that of practice. But we knew all the time that our self-remembering, even in the most favorable of circumstances, was very incomplete, and that beyond the little we had attained lay great stretches of more intense awareness. Looking back, as I now do from the vantage point of the present, I realize that far too little emphasis was placed by Ouspensky at this time on preparation for self-remembering, and it was only after we had met G many years later in Paris that we understood how necessary this was. The first step to self-remembering was to come back from our mind wandering into our bodies and to become sensible of these bodies. We all know, of course, that we possess limbs, a head, and a trunk, but in our ordinary state of waking sleep, we receive few or no sense impressions from these, unless we happen to be in pain. In other words, we are not really aware of our bodies, but G taught us special exercises, first for relaxing our muscles to the fullest possible extent, and then for sensing the various areas in our bodies, exercises to which reference will be made later in this book. These exercises became of immense value to us and were particularly useful as a preparation for self-remembering. Further research has shown me that many writers have experienced moments of accidental self-remembering and have left excellent accounts of them. One of the best descriptions of an intense degree of self-remembering is that given by Tennyson, who apparently had several experiences of this kind, evoked by the concept I a form of meditation which might easily lead to self-remembering. And this is a quote. For more than once when I sat all alone, revolving in myself, that word which is the limit of the self was loosed and passed into nameless as a cloud melts into heaven. I touched my limbs, the limbs were strange, not mine, and yet no shadow of doubt, but with clearness, and through loss of self, the gain of such large life as matched with ours were sun to spark, unshadowable in words themselves, but shadows of a shadow. Tennyson had a poet's emotional temperament, and he penetrated deeper into the state of self-remembering than most people are able to do, except after years of practice. He also managed to bring back from his experience clear-cut memories of it, and one of the things he recalled was that self-remembering brings with it qualitative as well as quantitative changes in consciousness. By this, I mean that a higher level of consciousness is the threshold to entirely new elements of experience, so that one seems to have stepped abruptly through a gateway into an entirely different world and mode of living. The small limiting self of everyday life, the self which insists on its personal rights and its separateness, is no longer there to isolate one from everything else, and in its absence one is received into a much wider order of existence, common to all that breathes. Separateness has gone, and as the clamor of thought within dies down into the inner silence, an overwhelming sense of being takes its place. Not only has the head ceased its chatter, but the very words it formerly used have lost all relevance. Such limiting concepts as yours or mine, his or hers, are meaningless in the boundless realm into which one has been received. And even those old divisions of time into before and after have been drowned into the fathomless depths of an ever-present now. So also has disappeared that distinction dear to the heart of the Western philosopher, the division between the subject and the object, the knower and the thing known. All the old partitions are down at that moment, and one becomes conscious of a unity, an intensity of existence, a blissfulness of being never experienced before. The Hindu describes this ecstatic state by the Sanskrit words sat, which is being, chit, which is consciousness, amanda, which is bliss, and it gives a fitting account of it. The conditions which, above all others, is demanded of those who enter this realm of the spirit to discover unity with it is that they should shed for the moment the selfhood of space and time, that tyrannous selfhood which Jalal-ud-Din has called the dark despot. All who have had experience of this other state are agreed upon this point. No creature, wrote St. Thomas Aquinas, can attain a higher grade of nature without ceasing to exist, and it is the existence of the everyday self which has to be sacrificed. Yet even as one revels in the unaccustomed lightness and freedom, one is aware of the fact that nearby is waiting to reclaim one that same lower and limiting self of everyday life. In a few minutes, the noisy machinery of thinking, feeling, and moving will start up again, and the inner silence will be broken. This feeling that the busybody self of everyday life is there waiting to claim one is very easily explained. When a higher state of consciousness is attained, it does not dislodge the state which it supplants, but is superimposed upon it. And, this being so, there exists an awareness of the close proximity of the thoughts and feelings of one's ordinary state. So close to one are these lower activities that there is a constant danger of their breaking through the thin partition and thus bringing self-remembering to an abrupt end. And it is precisely in this way that self-remembering does usually end. The attention wavers, the traffic in the head starts up its rumble again. The inner silence is shattered, and everything is as it was before. Again, William James is the only Western psychologist who shows an understanding of these higher states of consciousness. He writes that the two outstanding characteristics of these higher states are optimism and monism. We pass into mystical states from out of ordinary consciousness as from a less into a more, as from smallness into a vastness, and at the same time as from unrest to rest. We feel them as reconciling, unifying states. They appeal to the yes function more than to the no function in us. In them, the unlimited absorbs the limited and peacefully closes the account. William James might have added two other characteristics of higher states of consciousness, and more particularly of the highest state of all, cosmic consciousness. The first of these qualities is the intense conviction of truth which they carry with them. Difficult though the individual may find it to formulate what he has learnt, he has no doubt of its truth. It is knowledge which has been reached by a route other than that by which ordinary knowledge is acquired, namely, through the intermediary of the special senses and the reason. And it is direct and immediate knowledge as opposed to indirect and mediate knowledge. Richard Gregg puts very clearly the difference between these two ways of knowing. He writes that we can learn a great deal about an object in the external world by viewing it from a number of different angles and then giving a general description of it. But with this way of knowing, we are conscious of the separation between ourselves and the thing we are observing, so that it is knowing about it rather than knowing it. When we know something directly, this feeling of separation disappears. There is a blending of subject and object, a mutual absorption, a forgetting of everything else. There is often delight and exaltation, an enthusiasm, a rapture, a deep and abiding joy. It is not knowing from without. It is a knowing from within. It is not knowing about. It is unitive knowing. Unitive knowledge is much more complete and deeper than knowing about. This is from Richard Gregg, Self-Transcendence, Victor Gollancz, 1956. Different people have different attitudes to these two ways of knowing. Intellectuals and scholars distrust the direct, intuitive, and non-logical mental process described above, whilst artists, poets, mystics, and, strange to say, certain businessmen with great practical experience of life are more inclined to doubt the efficacy of logical processes. Each party is able to find justification for distrusting the other kind of knowing, since mistakes can and are often made with both methods. The truth is that each way of knowing has its value and is constantly being used. Even the scientist, the man who is specially expert in walking round a subject and viewing it from all angles, has probably started his peregrinations by accepting as true some idea reached intuitively and directly. The second characteristic of higher states of consciousness, and particularly of the highest state of all, is the marked change which takes place in the sense of time. Dr. Burke, a Canadian psychiatrist who made a special study of cosmic consciousness at the end of the last century, writes that the person who experiences cosmic consciousness will learn in the few minutes or moments of its continuance more than in months than in years of ordinary study, and he will learn much that no study ever taught a man or ever can teach him. Especially does he obtain a conception of the whole, or, at least, of such an immense whole as dwarfs all conception, a conception of it which makes his old attempts to grasp the universe and its meaning petty and ridiculous. Dr. Burke gives the following account of his own experience of cosmic consciousness in the third person, and it will be noted that he lays emphasis on the impression of light associated with it. He was in a state of quiet, almost passive enjoyment. All at once, without warning of any kind, he found himself wrapped around, as it were, by a flame-colored cloud. For an instant he thought of fire, some sudden conflagration in the great city. The next he knew that the light was within himself. Directly afterwards there came upon him a sense of exaltation, of immense joyousness, accompanied or immediately followed by an intellectual illumination quite impossible to describe. Into his brain streamed one momentary lightning flash of the Brahmic splendor which has ever since lightened his life. Upon his heart fell one drop of Brahmic bliss, leaving thenceforth for always an aftertaste of heaven. This is from R.M. Buck, Cosmic Consciousness. The experience of the man who has savored this highest of all levels of consciousness is always of this nature. He is overwhelmed by the magnitude and the splendor of the vision vouchsafed him, and is so convinced of its truth that nothing can shake his faith in it. He is astonished by how much has happened within so short a space of time. Finally, the memory of that moment of Brahmic splendor never fades and is treasured as something which has imparted a meaning to life. The above description applies only to the highest state of consciousness, or cosmic consciousness, a level which but few people have attained. In this chapter, we are concerned chiefly with the state below it, called by G, self-remembering, a state in which a man is able to see himself but not the universe objectively. Maurice Nicoll has described this less exalted state in these quiet words. Self-remembering comes down from above, and full self-remembering is a state of consciousness in which the personality and all its pretenses almost cease to exist, and you are, so to speak, nobody, and yet the fullness of this state, which is really bliss, makes you, for the first time, somebody.